This episode contains foul language that may not be suitable for some listeners, as well as audio inappropriate for some Geelong Football Club supporters. The views and opinions expressed during this interview are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any organization, company, and/or individual. All content provided are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any organization, company, and/or individual. Now on with the show. Exploration Radio is produced with the support of the Australian Institute of Geoscientists and the Minerals Council of Australia. Exploration Radio is also an official media partner of the 2022 PDAC conference. To find out more about these organizations, go to explorationradio.com. My name is Ahmad, and this is Exploration Radio, a podcast focusing on the past, present, and the future of exploration. On this week's episode, Steve and I got the chance to sit down with Dave Lawie, who's the Chief Geoscientist and Technologist at IMDEX Limited. Dave was one of the first people we wanted to talk to on this show, but it has taken us a while to get him on. So it seems fitting that he joins us for the 50th episode for our show. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as Steve and I did. Now on with the show.
Today we're talking to Dave Lawie, the Chief Geoscientist and Technologist at IMDEX, and we're going to talk about the development of biogas. So Dave, welcome to Exploration Radio. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks guys for getting me on here. I think the biogas stories, I think you'll find out in the course of this interview, is actually quite an interesting and funny story in a lot of ways. So I'm looking forward to putting that story out in the public domain. A bit scary to think it's going to be preserved on the internet forever and that my own kids will probably listen to it. So I might have to be a bit aware of that on the way through.
Yeah, so just don't stuff it up. That's all we can say.
That's right, exactly. So a bit about me. So I'm a bit odd, I suppose, in many ways, and a lot of people would agree with that. But I have both a PhD and a trade, which is certainly a bit odd, but I think that gives me quite a unique perspective on the world and people and the way people operate and technology, and it makes me extremely comfortable talking to the C-suite of a mining company or going into a workshop and being out on the shop floor and talking to all the tradies and people who do real work. Mm-hmm. Makes me extremely comfortable doing that, and I can strike up a good rapport with people. And I think later on we'll talk about starting up a business and trying to run a small business. I think that element of having a really good rapport with people is really, really important, because these things are always about people.
So just one quick question. Did you want, did you have a plan of combining that kind of technical PhD space with kind of where the rubber meets the road with people using it?
Absolutely fucking not.
Okay. Good. Excellent. Yep.
So there is a bit of a history here. So I started off in engineering at university, and people listening to this will be horrified probably, but I did my first and one of my best business deals in my life, where I got near to the end of second year in electrical engineering, but I'd run so far off the rails by that point that the head of department called me in and he offered me a deal, and he said, "Dave, if you just leave, I'll make sure it never appears on your record that you were ever here. But if you stay, you're going to fail everything at the end of the second year. There'll be a permanent record of it." So I elected just to leave at that point.
Perfect.
So that was my first significant deal of any size that I've ever done.
Yep.
But it turned out actually to be very good. And then I started the trade after that. I was at a loose end, I suppose. So I applied to do an apprenticeship ironically, as an instrument technician. I now work for a company that builds instruments for the exploration and mining industry. Again, that was completely unplanned.
Yep.
But I worked in an oil refinery for 4 years, and working with lots of very impressive technical equipment.
Yep.
And that was, extremely educational, working in heavy industry, working in process control. We can literally pull a wire out of the wall and blow up a plant, right? So that you learn a lot when you're doing that, and it's an incredible amount of responsibility for a young apprentice to take that on. Mm-hmm. But that's just what you do. Yep. And I often talk to people at work now that when I went into the mining industry, because obviously safety is very important when you're working in an oil refinery, everyone pays attention because the risk of blowing yourself up is very high at all times.
Yep.
So you take it very seriously. But when I got into the mining industry, I'm talking 20 years ago now, that was absolutely not the case, of course. Things have changed now. And I actually think our own industry is really still catching up. And one of my pet topics is Safety is not following a rote list of things. Safety is in your head, and you're the person that's responsible for your own safety, and be in the moment and think about it. So we've already wandered quite a bit off track.
No, that's all right. So, what was
So at the end of the apprenticeship, I was working for Shell. They wanted to send me to The Hague and for me to do chemical engineering, sponsor me through that. But I really didn't want to work in oil refineries for the rest of my life. Interesting places, but from a technical point of view, but I just didn't want to do it. But I did decide I was going to go back to university, have another go. So different time this time around. Now I knew how I could play up and get the work done. Yeah. Rather than just the playing up bit.
Yeah. You were a more rounded individual.
More rounded, yeah, sort of. But I actually went to do natural resource management in the university that ran the best natural resource management course in Australia was the University of New England up in Ahmad in northern New South Wales. But because I'd had some university credits when I went up there, not many people know these stories. It's funny to be telling the world now. But when I went up there to do it, because I had credits, the natural resource management included, you had to do first year geology, but they typically did it in their second year as to round out the knowledge base. But I did it in first year. I didn't know the first fucking thing about geology when I got to the university. And I sat there and I still, to this day, remember the very first lectures being run by Barry McKelvey. And he used to go to the Antarctic every 2 years. In fact, he's got an Antarctic medal. Yep. I was sitting there and he was just showing pictures of Antarctica and the geology, and that was it. I was just sold. Yep. That was it. I ended up doing geology then.
Yeah, wow.
And then went on to do the PhD. But I think the things that, given my engineering bent first time round, I've always liked the more quantitative aspects of geoscience, so geochemistry, which is where I ended up specialising in, but also geophysics and anything you can attach numbers to. Maths. Basically, the maths side of geology really interested me. Yep. And also a strong desire to understand the fundamentals of the science. So, reactions happen for a reason, thinking about thermodynamics and processes and flows and structures and pressure differentials, all those sorts of things are really what excited me about geology. And I'm the sort of mind that I need to know how things work. Even, when we start talking about iogas, and even all of the maths that's going in iogas will have been simulated or tested, especially in the early days. I would work out some way of doing it in Excel to teach myself, so I knew exactly what the maths was doing before we handed it over to the devs to go into the software product.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So anyway, I suppose I really, really like the numerate side of the geosciences.
And you never thought of being an academic? There's a leading question.
Well,
be careful what you say next, Dave.
I know, given the esteemed company here. I love teaching.
Yeah.
I really love teaching, and I've actually done quite a bit of teaching in universities over the years, and run lots of workshops internally for companies as well. I really like that. I like dealing with postgraduate and professional people. I don't think I could just do the same courses year in, year out, teaching undergraduate, things like that. It's just not my gig. But I do. I mean, I was actually thinking about this on the way up in the car. Research universities, and like one of the interesting things about being a geoscientist, and I think we forget that we're geoscientists. We're scientists, right? Often that gets forgotten by geos, much to their detriment, actually. But on the way over, I was thinking, what career can you have in science where you can go to your boss and say, I've got a hypothesis, can you give me a few $1 million to test it? And you go out and test it, right? Oh, that didn't fucking work. Can I give another few $1 million and test this other hypothesis? Sure, here you go out and test that. I don't know another field of science where you can get that amount of money to test all the crazy ideas within reason that you might have, right?
Yeah.
Then it becomes geoscience and exploration becomes an experiment, and that's the all-important aspect of it is the design of experiment aspect of geoscience is, I think, something that we don't think through. And I think even the undergraduate teaching in a way has forgotten that working as a professional geoscientist, you're there to create hypotheses and test them the best way possible. Yep. Get the design of the experiment done correctly. Make sure that whatever you do has the best chance of answering the hypothesis that you're testing. So too much, well off track here again, but I think too much exploration work goes on that doesn't have a clear ending or an outcome, right? The work is designed not to answer the question in the most efficient way possible.
You're singing from my hymn sheet here. We had your mate John Van on the podcast, and we ended up talking for several hours about exactly this topic.
Yes.
We could do well to remember. So let's get into how you got into the mining industry from your PhD. Who did you join, and how did that come about?
Yeah, well, in fact, this time a fairly well-worn path. So I was doing my PhD out in the Aleri block out the other side of Broken Hill, for those people who don't know where it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I was working, doing it, and Pasminco was exploring out there at the time. And they were running an air core drilling campaign out in the middle of fucking nowhere, right? And kept hitting gold, but couldn't work out why there was gold in this air core campaign. But because I'd been studying the landscape and the geochemistry out there, they was going to just come out and have a look at it. And old mate Nick Cook was out there working at the time. So I went out there and had a look, and because I'd been studying the exposed landscape, I'd worked out that when you're out in the plains, that in fact you're dealing, what you could see in the Aleri Hills was identical to what you're drilling into out in the Banagiri Ridge, but it was just covered, like, 30, 50, 80 metres of tertiary and sometimes Cretaceous rocks. And so, but it was hard, right? You need to, again, it's process and thinking, because there'd been a deep weathering profile there. I didn't expect to be talking so much about geology, but anyway, there was quite a deep weathering profile there, which had been stripped off and redeposited on these tributaries and creeks in the pre-tertiary times. So you had a deep weathering profile, which was very fine-grained kaolinite, because it was deeply weathered. So it's really almost mineable grade kaolinite. But that had been half eroded off and put into the tertiary sediments, which were also kaolinite and laminated. So if you're drilling with an air core rig and just looking at chips, you don't know whether you're going from tertiary to Proterozoic. Right? It's very, very difficult to tell.
Yep.
And so the running hypothesis at the time was that the gold mineralisation was within the Proterozoic basement rocks. But I spent enough time looking at them, and I just thought it was one of those aha moments sitting out in the core farm there, lining the old-fashioned stuff, right? Just getting the fucking drill chip trays out and lining them up in order that they were drilled like a fence line, and just staring at them on the bench and going along. And then it finally occurred to me, oh my God, all this gold's actually sitting at the unconformity between the Proterozoic and the tertiary.
Yeah.
It was not a basement deposit at all. It was a paleo fucking placer gold deposit.
Is this North Portia? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was basement mineralisation as well, but this part of the mineralised system was a paleo placer deposit, which of course, talking about geological models and testing hypotheses and things, there's a whole pile of hypotheses went straight out the window at that point. But 4 on this road. But then once we found that out, we started logging where the unconformity was, and you could actually map out the paleo landscape and the channels, and you could almost predict where the gold would be in these channels. But then you could look at them and go, well, let's follow these. It's like ancient stream sediment sampling, right? Just let's follow them back up to the source on the ridge and find the primary source of mineralisation. At North Portia, as a case, there would have been the primary mineralisation sitting in the basement, which had been weathered and then dispersed. The gold had become agglomerated and dispersed into the paleo channels.
Wow.
But there was also it's a chemist's playground, that place, because that's where you got the Beverly uranium deposit, the roll fronts as well.
Yep.
It's all evaporates and everything. Strange rocks.
It is. And still, to this day, and I'm talking about Pasminco, right? Pasminco was doing this work, and so as I was doing that, I was at the latter stages of my PhD, and I was just out there working, and I said, we actually need a geochemist. We know you haven't finished. It's a classic, right? We know you haven't finished your PhD yet, but do you want a job? And of course, said, of course I do. So Paul Roberts was my boss at the time, and I flew down to Melbourne from Broken Hill, and I think we went out for lunch to have a bit of an interview. I think we sat there for about 6 hours talking about geology, and geochemistry. That was it. There was the job for the taking.
Yep.
It was a great job for someone straight out of uni, actually, the principal geochemist for Pasminco and a global zinc explorer, travel the world, learning all this stuff. It was just amazing.
Were you looking to get into industry at that time? Like, is that an intention you had?
Yes, it was. And I do like research and teaching, but I always regarded always knew that I wasn't going to be just a generalist geologist, that I was going to specialise.
Yeah.
And so in a way, and this might upset some academics listening, but I regarded the PhD as a trade ticket. More or less the same thing for me. It just allowed me to go into the industry but specialise in something very technical and also very numerate. And that's the way it worked out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you weren't. So you wanted to have more of an applied sense to whatever you were kind of learning in that sense.
Yeah. No, I think ultimately I'll always be an applied. Applied person. Do something.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe that's the tradie in me, right?
That's right.
So Ahmad and I both work for MMG, which is ex-Zinifex, which is ex-Pasminco. So it's very diluted by this point, but I think I understand elements of the Pasminco culture. One of the great explorers of yesteryear.
Yeah.
So what was it like working for Pasminco?
Yeah, look, I often reflect on it now about what such a good exploration group that group was.
Oh, amazing!
It was, the data we had, the global view. There was nothing we didn't know about zinc. We're a zinc exploration company. We got distracted by gold and other things occasionally, but pretty things. But zinc. So anyone could bring any zinc project to us from anywhere in the world, and we'd have an opinion on it in 15 minutes. About what it was worth and whether it was worth farming into or buying off them. Just because we had this enormous database of every zinc project. We knew every zinc mine. We knew all of the operating parameters of the mines, their input costs. We could, from a conceptual point of view in exploration at the time, we could model any style of zinc deposit anywhere on the planet and work out whether we could mine it economically.
Yeah, wow.
All of that, which really informed our exploration process. So we would only go to places where we knew that if what we were looking for was there, we could mine economically, period. Right? We didn't muck around with anything else.
So it sounds like the company was very kind of technically driven. Is that a fair comment?
Very. And really, I'd like to this day, I think there's some really high caliber geos in that team. Well, geoscientists really.
Yep.
It worked in an it's a bit like Western Mining, I suppose. The technical teams were all very integrated with the operational exploration teams. There was we used to use conditional probabilities to work out where we'd go and what we'd do next, and change the sequencing of methods and technologies when you'd bring them to bear on the exploration project. You might start out. I used to tell the project generation guys, you just tell me where on the fucking planet when you've zeroed it down to a few hundred kilometres, then I'll come in and help you out. But all the other wanky stuff, you just get on.
That's right.
But we had some good fun as well.
So so this is a bit of a tangent, and I want to ask it now because we're kind of talking about it. Yeah, I guess for someone, from my generation, you kind of hear of these companies like Zinifex and Pasminco and WMC and like Mount Isa, all of which were very technically driven for a long, long time. But we don't seem to talk about companies in the same sense now that they are, where they're maybe perhaps technically driven to that extent. For someone that has kind of gone from that era to this era and still kind of deals with companies, you can choose not to answer this question, but I know you probably won't. But do you want to?
You probably know I have an opinion.
Wow. I'm hoping the glass of wine will help there. But do you care to comment a little bit about why we seem to have that two kind of distinct eras? Like, how come companies used to be more technically focused, once upon a time, and we don't seem to kind of talk about them in the same vein now?
Yeah, it's a good question. You've got to be a bit careful as well about looking at the past through rose-coloured glasses as well. So you've got to sort of remove that bias from your thinking, I suppose. And if I make some of these comments, I'll probably be a bit too general as well, because I know it's not the case everywhere.
I understand that, there's kind of the concept of survivorship bias as well. The companies that were bad, obviously no one talks about them because they, went into the sands of time. But we obviously talk about the companies that succeeded. But, in general terms, it seems to be that we probably focused a little bit more on, I guess, the technical development of companies and people, once upon a time. Maybe we don't have the same focus now.
For sure. And there was things like mentoring, right? There was I don't know if you make this stuff up or not when you think about it, but there was a more even age distribution, I think, in the industry back then as well. So if you went into the industry at 25, you're probably working with someone who was helping that was 30 and their boss might have been 40 and they'd have managed was 50.
Yeah.
And, there was that passing up and down the line of experience and wisdom, and you had time to learn things. It's a gross generalisation, but I think it's true. I think the other, if you go back to that era, there was a big emphasis on get data.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So generate data. That's your job, right, as geoscientists. Go out, generate new data, and we'll look at it. Whereas I think, and this might be changing now because the exploration's ramping up all around the world again, as it should. But I think we went through an era where people just wanted to recycle data and not go to the time, effort, trouble, money, etc., to generate new stuff, right? And old data is useful when you put it together and relook at it. That's fine, but it's still old data. It's always, people forget it. It was collected at a certain time here in a certain way, analysed a certain way, all that sort of thing, and so it's all compromised. And even in the goldfields here, if you look at a map of drilling, you go, "Fuck me dead, there's nothing left to find there." That's the shit drilled out of it. But actually, you go, well, actually, wait on. None of these drill holes are deeper than 100 metres over huge areas, and they might have at the time, this hypothesis testing regime with some of the gold explorers back in the day would assay for gold and nothing else, right? Gold has a very small footprint when you're drilling for it, whereas maybe if you did arsenic with it, you'd have a slightly bigger footprint to look for. So things like that. But people think that if you pull all this data out and you're looking at those gold assays, that you're done, right? Oh, yeah, I had a look at that. There's nothing there. You go, wait on. How can you say that? you just can't say that, right? How about you go back and drill a deeper hole? Have a punt. Here's 250 grand. Go and drill a kilometre deep hole there and have a look. Test your hypothesis. Let's see what's there, and that will inform our next decision. Now, clearly, companies do that, but they probably happened more 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I did kind of ask the question in a leading way, because you got back to your point. I think what you said earlier on is that, we do have to kind of remember that, we are a hypothesis testing kind of business. And so I think, not to throw any shade at companies nowadays, but I think, that shift where maybe we don't put as much importance into that aspect, maybe has elicited this behavior where now we are, not necessarily kind of having a process right from a technical point of view. And then hence that's created this behavior that we're not, valuing that aspect anymore.
Yeah, and you could even take it to another level. So CRA, right, the old Rio Tinto, or the other way around, whatever you look at it, you'll probably get a few emails about that. But, CRA, with their systematic exploration, they had a lot of opinion. Well, we don't know what we don't know, a bit like that Rumsfeld quote. So whatever you're doing, we're just going to, an ICP ES analysis come out where you could do 35 elements, quite efficiently and cheaply. They just say every sample goes to 35 elements. That's it, right? There's no picking and choosing, no exploration manager. Back then, going, no, I only want copper, lead, and zinc, nothing else. No.
Can only be $12 a sample. Can't be 14. Totally 12.
They said no. It gets analysed for everything. It said because they said you don't know when we'll be back. We'll change our hypothesis, perhaps, and then we can go back to that data and we have the data to evaluate it without needing to do more work. Right?
CRA was a great explorer.
Yes.
But very different to Pezmenko and Western Mining. But that theory is also lost. That culture's also been lost for some reason. We've worked with ex-CRA people who go, no, you don't want to be out wasting your time being the first to collect things. Whereas, so Western Mining, Pezmenko are trying to outthink their way. CRA are trying to outdata their way and things. And somehow we've all got mixed up that neither is worth doing and that we should be recycling things that already exist. It's like crazy that we've ended up in this space. Choose one of the models. It doesn't really matter. There's a bit of aggro sometimes between CRA and WMC people.
Yes.
But you know what? I don't really care.
Yeah.
Both of them were choosing to find something for the first time.
Yeah, there were two different ways to kind of skin the cat to some degree, right? So, that was it. I mean, and both were successful by employing different methods. So.
No. I'm always fond of a quote from Robert Friedland, which is the best way to outperform someone is to go where they haven't been. the way he used to phrase it was, the best way to find an Easter egg is to go where your brother and sister haven't looked. That is so lost at the moment, where people will go, no, I'll go back to exactly where people have already been.
Mm-hmm. Right, and people forget that lost or unknown space is often where things have been found, but at a kilometre depth, right? And
that's how.
So there's not much deep drilling goes on still, and you look at the S&P numbers and that, and there really still isn't a lot of deep drilling.
No, that's high. And I think maybe it's the fact that, for whatever we seem to be in a different kind of fiscal setup now as well, where people, they, I always think it's a little bit strange when people want something big, people want something of high value, but they're not wanting to invest an appropriate amount to get that value. It's kind of like if you're not taking on a certain level of risk, then your return is never going to be to that level. So unless you're wanting to put that money in, the commensurate kind of reward you're going to get is always going to be capped at some level.
Oh yeah. And I think the other mistake we sometimes make now, there's if you have a strategy and a program, doesn't mean you're going to find what you're looking for in the first half of that program. You need to execute the whole fucking program, right? Because there's some chance it's the last hole you drill in the program, but if you get bored halfway through, it's not working. So wait on. The program wants to do this quantum of work, and if you stop halfway through,
that's right.
You've not tested the hypothesis, so to come back to that point.
And that's why I think that scientific theory is really important, back to the concept. If you haven't tested a hypothesis, you haven't explained an EM conductor, you haven't explained a feature that you were looking at, then you haven't done anything. You've got to finish a program. The amount of times when people suddenly assume that things are not going to work out, even though history tells us that you've got a serendipity. We did a whole 2-3 hours on serendipity. Come on. We know how important these things are,
Yeah. And I mean, we're kind of getting into a point where, we'll talk about what you did with Iogas, but I think, that's kind of an example of where, there's a certain level of commitment, in R&D and things like that. And if you kind of look at exploration's R&D, or you look at these things, you have to kind of accept that a certain percentage of your investment will be inefficient, but you're hoping that a certain percentage of it is efficient enough for you to give you the reward that you want. And then that's kind of the challenge I think that we find ourselves in, that we don't want to be labored with the fact that we've had too much inefficient kind of investment, so hence make no investment, because that's a way to kind of eliminate that inefficient investment.
I could talk about this topic for hours, but I actually know a funny story about you finishing your PhD, but I think I'll let you tell it.
So this is the interface from PhD to working at Pasminco. So I didn't finish the PhD before I started working at Pasminco, as you might expect. I'm not the only person that's done that.
Yeah, well, there's 2 people in this room that haven't finished their PhD, so let's just go with that.
I haven't finished my bachelor's.
So I just went into, so I literally got the PhD and stuck it in boxes and threw it in the garage. Say, I'll write that. Yeah. And of course, I was working as a principal geochemist. I was traveling continuously around the world, so it wasn't going to fucking happen by any means. Yeah. But something must have been happening in the back of my mind, because I was saving up annual leave and thinking at some point, well, I'll take a chunk of annual leave and do it, which also proved to be problematic. But Pasminco started to go bad and go under through no fault of the exploration department. I might, might have something to do with hedging and an implementation of SAP. But anyway, let's not talk about that. And the price of zinc tanking. But anyway, so as it was sliding out the back door slowly but surely, exploration. We were talking about funding and where you spend your money. So the funding dried up for exploration. Things got cut, field programs got cut back, and then there was ban on travel. Well, it's pretty difficult to do exploration, not allowed to travel. So people were sitting around the head office twiddling their thumbs going, well, what the hell are we going to do? And I thought, I said, this is it. This is my chance to actually go home, take my 6 or 7 weeks of saved up annual leave and just write the PhD. Yep. And to this day, I don't quite know how I got motivated, but that's exactly what I did. I took the leave. I went home, I got it out of the boxes a few years later now. It's all bloody brain cells that were most definitely toasted in the intervening 3 years. So I dug the thing out and wrote it in 6 weeks. And that was, what? I don't know where to start with that. So, I mean, it's 16 hours a day, just continuously writing, reading papers, trying to put all that shit back in your head and then regurgitate it onto a sheet. At least 2 packets of cigarettes a day just to keep me alive and going. Oops.
Are you still married?
Yeah, well, and of course, we had a young child and I can't remember, had 1 or 2. God, there you go. It's bad. God. Sorry, boys. 2, maybe 1 very little. But my wife moved out. Actually moved in with my parents in Geelong. That's how bad I was. You've got to be bad for your wife to move in with your parents.
yeah, that's right.
But the whole house was just a shitstorm of bloody paper and stuff spread over the place. But I finally finished it. Got it to a point where I could give it to someone to read and correct it. But a mate came over, and he came over and he said, he looked at me, and all my mates didn't quite know what I'd been up to. He looked at me and said, "Are you crook, Dave? You got cancer or something?" So he actually asked me because I was just dead pale with black bags under my eyes and looked ill, actually, just probably from the 2 packets of cigarettes a day and no sleep for weeks on end. Yeah. But anyway, I got the damn thing in. It was a miracle, I think. I'm so glad I did in the end.
Yeah.
Do that.
Nudge. Twist.
But let that be a lesson to other PhD students. Like, by the time you finish, you look like a cancer patient. That's the answer.
Inspiration.
Yeah, that's right.
So how did
I think my supervisor Paul Ashley was possibly the most surprised person on the planet.
So from there to Anglo, how did that happen?
Yeah, so another one of these stories. So while I was finishing my PhD and Pasminco was going under, Anglo American was looking for a geochemist, and old mate Nigel Brand was the Australian geochemist at the time here in Perth. I was living over in Melbourne and Geelong, and he said, Chris Oates, who was going to be my boss at Anglo, was looking for another geochemist, and so I ended up being retrenched from Pasminco, and you've got to be retrenched once or twice in your life. It helps you buy furniture and stuff like that after you've been a student, literally. We still have some of that furniture we bought with the retrenchment money. So I got retrenched on the Friday and started work on Monday with Anglo American. And again, similarly, a big base metal explorer. I've always, I think it's a tradie for me. I mean, I've worked in gold and consulting and everything, but when working for companies as an explorer, I've only really wanted to work for base metal companies because I've always wanted to find stuff that's useful, that you build shit with, not that you stick underground and use it as something to back up your currency.
And, I understand that completely.
Useful
I'm sure
stuff. Let's find some useful
don't.
industrial stuff, right? And so then I started with Anglo, and again, and I moved to Vancouver, so I lived in Vancouver, but I was in a global role with Anglo American again, but working out of the Vancouver office, and again, it's different crew to who John Van works with there now. It was quite a while ago. But again, just a terrific group of people, really, really fantastic. I was just telling someone the other day and they say, "How are you going with not travelling, Dave?" I said, "Well, I was all right until about a month ago. Now I'm not okay, actually, with not travelling. Get out of this place. Buddy McGowan's got us all trapped here." Prick. That's Comrade McGowan for those who are overseas.
Emperor. He's emperor now.
Yeah.
Daddy McGowan.
Daddy.
Yeah, stay daddy.
He might let us out to play another sometime. But, the places you see and go as doing exploration. And I've been to Peru many times. Have I been to Machu Picchu? No. But have I been up in
I've
the
been
high...
to Cusco without going to Machu Picchu.
Yeah,
That's
right.
even worse.
But have I been in the high Andes in the middle of absolutely nowhere, just hanging out? Yes. With the locals, drinking some home-brewed moonshine stuff out of a plastic bottle they carry around in the back of the Tojo.
Yes.
Yes, sleeping in a tent with them. Yes, that's all of the real fun stuff, and I think that might be lost. Maybe that's another thing that's a bit lost on the industry, but that's actually fun.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think
that's real boys' own stuff and girls' own now, of course. But that's why you do it. You get out and you do all this stuff, and
I mean, in the current environment of risk mitigation, I think that a lot of that stuff is Yeah, it's definitely dead, I think.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to justify, I think, a lot of that kind of stuff now.
It's amazing because one of the things that I've been accused of is being too romantic about what is exploration, and I just do not apologise for that, because I think a lot of people listen to stories like that and stories like we tell, and that's what they want from their careers.
Yep.
That they want that lifestyle. Otherwise, you choose a different career.
And you should.
And you
choose
should.
a different career if you don't want to do that. Yeah,
no, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, if someone had told me even when I was at uni doing geology, that at some point in my professional life I'd be wearing snowshoes out in the middle of fucking Alberta somewhere, drilling frozen soil samples out of the ground, I would have said, what? But that's what you end up doing, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, you just end up doing stuff like that.
Yeah.
Drinking caipirinhas in the middle of the Amazon and Core Farm. And
That's right. Yeah.
with the boys there just pulling the sugar cane straight out of the field next door and crushing it up in the glass. It's just, I mean, really, not every day's like that, of course, but those days make up for a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's
right.
So we better talk about iogas.
Right.
So let's start with an obvious, because it seems a bit strange to have a conversation about a piece of software. But let's start with what is iogas.
Yeah. No, it's evolved, I suppose. But look, fundamentally, it's a package designed for geoscientists for doing what I'd call exploratory data analysis, with the emphasis being on easy to use, very not a steep learning curve, very visual. I've obviously done a lot of teaching around iogas over the years, but this, I think yes, we're scientists and all the rest of it, but I think to take a statistical approach to geoscientific data is actually the wrong thing to do. I think geoscientists, maybe if they've got a leaning or a natural inclination, as they're typically visual people, think in 3D. Also, these are skills most people don't have, right? Even thinking in 3D, but we get trained to do it. But I think if you can present data to people in an interesting visual way that's interactive, people can work out what's going on with it very quickly, actually. Because if there's one thing that the human brain is very good at, it's looking at patterns and spatial representations of data. Yeah. And in fact, that's a very difficult thing to replicate with these fancy data science, analytics, whatever you want. It's actually very difficult to replicate. So, with iogas, it doesn't replace thinking. It presents the data to you in a way that allows you to work out what the answer is, if I can surmise it like that, which is philosophically quite a different way to go about doing something like that. I don't think iogas should ever give you the answer. It should help you come to the answer as efficiently as possible.
Yep. So it does. You don't need to know all the fundamentals, though.
You don't, and we can tell what people use in gas now. That's got Google stuff in it, and they're all anonymised, of course. That comes back. So we know what people are doing and what they use. And to this day, with all of the users around the world, the really simple things that were been in gas from day one are still the most popular. And I think the clever thing about the interface is it's really easy to show someone how to use it. Like in 15 minutes, he's saying, this is how gas works. There's a couple of paradigms, and they can use it very effectively from that point on. But then it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland. You disappear down the bloody rabbit hole because you can just go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper if you want to, right? If your brain gets drawn into it.
That's right.
And you can then start splitting apart and pulling apart all of these really quite deep relationships in data.
So one obvious question I have is, everything that you said makes total sense. Was that the original intention of iogas?
So let me go back a bit further then. That's where gas is now, I suppose. But so when I've been involved in software for looking at geochemistry and geoscience for a long time, actually. Even going back to my PhD, which had a heavy. I mean, if I was renaming my PhD now, it'd be called analytics and geochemistry or something. Right? But back then, it was just applied maths. Very much more unsexy word. But even back then, I was compiling Fortran code and writing Fortran myself just to do this stuff. But then even when I was working at Pasaminco, I worked with some devs to get some of that stuff I'd done in Fortran reprogrammed in Visual Basic, for example, just to make it accessible and a bit more easily usable. I helped the guys writing Discover, the add-on to Map Info, put some geochemistry tools into that. This is all pre-iogas, remember? This upset some people.
Yeah.
And worked, Owen Parfrey, who's ever listening to this, he used to work for me at Pasminco. Then he went off to work for Discover and Encom and do the programming for it. And then even when I was with Anglo, I worked a lot with Geosoft and building their geochem module as well. So I've always been tried to democratize the process of doing this sort of work, make it more available. So when I went to IO, so this is another step in the story after Anglo. So when I was at Pasminco, I worked with Steve Winter, who I was the chief geochemist. He was the chief computing geologist, I didn't call it at the time. But he went out and started IO Digital, which is sort of an off-premise GIS and database management service for Pasminco. And so this is ironic. I signed the very first purchase order to get IO Digital running for Steve. That's when I was with Pasminco. Then IO Digital was running along for 3 or 4 years, and then Steve, who I know very well, he came and visited me in Vancouver, and we're just drinking out the back or something. And he said, "Why don't you come and join IO, and let's do some geochem stuff in IO?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." That was about the extent of the thought process, actually. Which in hindsight might not be, whatever. So I threw in a perfectly good and promising and very large career with a big multinational company to go and do something quite mad and entrepreneurial. But I knew I was going to do something like that at some day. I just knew it was. I think near the end we might talk about this sort of stuff. But if it's in you, you've got to do it. If you never do it, you'll go to the grave and regret never doing it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
you have to scratch that itch at some point.
You have to scratch that itch, yeah. And I rang up Graham Brown, who was my boss at the time over in London, and I must have sent him an email overnight or something. And Graham Brown, who's Scottish, rang me up in the morning in Vancouver with his Scottish accent. "Dave, what the fuck are you doing? Why the fuck have you resigned?" I said, "Graham, I need to go and just do this and start a company with Steve and build it up." And to this day we still have a joke about it. And Graham said, "Oh, that's all right then. I understand. That's fine." Yeah. I think he was probably more concerned I was going to BHP or something like that.
That's
it would be more annoying for it. But so then joined IO and then moved to lovely Perth, which again is a funny story because I always knew I'd end up living in Perth, and being an eastern stater, I always thought Perth was a backwater, to put it politely.
And let's just be honest.
You come from Geelong, Dave.
Well, there you go. And I still thought Perth was a backwater.
Yeah, okay.
But I used to joke with my mates saying the only way I could possibly move to Perth would be to come back to Australia from outside the country and go straight there. Otherwise, I'd never make it. And that's exactly what happened. But 20 years ago, Perth was a horrible backwater. There's no doubt. Yeah. There's still, even back then, I think only just gotten past having rostered bloody chemists and everything. Anyway, let's not get on about it. It's much different these days.
Are you going to rant about the daylight savings next?
No. There are some things which I've just purged my brain and don't mention it anymore.
So just talking about gas, obviously, at what stage does it go from gas to...
Yeah, so let me come back to gas. And so IO Digital at the time, so we renamed it IO Global. So it did web-based data management. And I started up the geochemistry consulting business as part of IO at the time. And, I took a lot of advice from Mike Etheridge at the time about running a consultancy. At the time, Encom and SRK were part owners of IO at the time, which is not well known, actually. But so we were running a consultancy, starting to get a few people on. Mike Whitbread, who I helped supervise his PhD, came on. He was working for us, starting to build that out. But, trying to do geochemical consultancy using a combination of fucking Excel, Datadesk, SPSS, Systat, Statistica, BDMP, all this stuff, right? None of it was just that great. And it made it, the thing that really annoyed me was it was impossible to actually teach manipulating geochemical data properly using a whole shitstorm of that stuff, right?
Yeah. And there's also a barrier to entry in that. You know, if you have a lot of software platforms or applications, like not everyone has the full toolkit, right? Like people have some and others have nothing. And
a geo's not going to go and ask their boss, can I buy a statistic?
Right.
And the boss goes, what the fuck do you want that for?
That's right.
So just to paint this picture, what's the status of geochemistry in the industry at this stage?
Yeah, so concentrated, concentrated in a few people, right? I would say, very, very, well, including myself, I suppose, at the time, but very concentrated in a few people, very
in decline globally.
I would say very few people. So this is one of the problems I think with what was going on. Was people were collecting more geochemical data because the analytical methods allowed it, but doing less and less with it, right? And then you got the thing saying, they might fight to get $20 to do an assay and get a multi-element assay, and then never use it. And then the boss says, "Well, you're not doing that again. You're back to $12 now if you're not going to use it." Right? But it was there are no new theories, right? All the stuff you can do with geochemistry data is well known, but doing it, you really needed a consultant to do it, right? Otherwise, you just couldn't do it. And there were very few people who could do it. One of the things which is useful in geochemistry is using classification type diagrams that get published in the academic literature. Now, to make practical use of those things is virtually impossible, right? It really is. They may as well not exist most of the time because you can't use them unless you're extremely dedicated. And people would be turning a classification diagram into a map in MapInfo and using coordinates as geochem columns to plot them on, and then, all this sort of stuff.
That's right.
You do it once, and next time you go, no. And they probably stuffed it up as well. Right? But if it's got a molar ratio, oh my God, I fucked that up.
Right.
I fucked up the calculation. It's all wrong. But
Or to get like the control lines and all of those kind of reference lines. What a fucking pain in the ass that used to be.
Yeah. Yep. So this is where Simon Gatehouse and Scott Halley come into the story. So I wasn't the only person that had the shits about this situation. So Simon, 10 years before gas became iGas, was working on a gas, if you like, which was scripts working in ArcView, not ArcGIS. Most people won't even know what ArcView is, but it's an ancient version of ArcGIS. And in S+, which became R. This is all ancient fucking history, right? But that IP moved along a few, like RGC and companies like that Simon and Scott worked for. Ended up in Barrick, and Barrick thought, well, it's actually quite useful. There was just a whole bunch of little routines to doing some stuff simple. And a guy called Andrew Scott, who worked for Barrick at the time, contracted Cargini, a little software company here in Perth run by John Jessup, to rewrite it as a standalone bit of desktop software.
Yeah, wow.
And so John rewrote it, wrote a little standalone program in Java to more or less sort of replicate what all those little scripts were doing, which he did. But then, and John had the IP for it then, John Jessup, but he didn't know what to do with it. He said, well, I've done it. Now what? And so that just at that time I was studying geochemistry. And so I knew John previously. So he came around and said, look, I've got this thing. Do you want to buy it and keep developing it? And in fact, the first time around I said, no, it's a piece of shit. Because it was. Actually, sorry, John. It was a piece of shit. And so I said, no, go away. It was so bad that we'll keep willing to keep using all those other rubbish conglomeration of other things. Yeah. But then Phil Baker, who was working for Western Mining actually at the time, he came to us and said, to Iowa and said, can you guys make a system where I can classify my samples on different classification diagrams without it being an existential nightmare, right? And I was thinking, I said, man, did that gas thing, I think that had some element of a classification thing in it. So I said to John, come in again. Had a look at it, and it could. It was really bad, though. It was terrible. But it was enough, right? It was just, it's little things that, the world's non-linear. It's little things and little coincidences come together and launch you off in a different direction. It was just enough. And I said to John, well, yeah, we'll buy it off you, but we've got no fucking money, of course. So we'll give you a bit of cash, but we'll pay for it out of royalties for future software sales. And so we did a deal, right, to purchase the IP. And that was the start of it. It was called gas at the time, and you'd have to ask Simon, I'm not sure quite why, graphical analysis system, geochemical analysis system, something like that. And I still remember this day sitting in the office for a day trying to work out a new name for it, and I'll just call it iogas, right? So that's what we did, which was fine. So we took it on, and we didn't have any Java developers right after buying it. So Rob Wall, who was working for John Jessup doing some contract work for him, John said, well, Rob is a really good Java dev, why don't you get him to do it? So in the early days, it was done outside of working hours, if you like. So it would be us chatting on a very ancient version of Microsoft Messenger, just that old thing. Mm-hmm. In the evening, most likely me drinking, him half renovating his house while he was talking to me, and just at night, just doing it. And he was just working on it. We're just paying him by the hour, just to put enough into it and just to clean it up a bit and add a few things into it to make it a minimum viable product's actually a bit of a joke. It was a minimum viable something. I wouldn't have called it a product at the time. Yeah. But just enough. And we got it to a point where I think we might have even called it version 0.9 as a tacit admission that it wasn't a completely fully fledged and supported product. There were no help files, nothing. Right? Yeah. But we put it on the market, and there was a Geochem conference here in Perth, actually. It must have been 2004 or 6 or something. And put a little thing up saying we're selling it. And we made our first sale at that conference, and it was $950 at the time. And the guy that bought it actually brought to us at the booth $950 in a brown paper bag to buy it. And Steve and I, being so hopelessly honest, actually banked it. There's things you look back in your life and go, why did we do that? Yeah. we should have gone straight down to the bloody casino or something. Had a night out and celebrated our first sale without paying any tax on it, of course. But then we're off and running, right? And the Geochem team was building up in IO. We're doing lots and lots of consulting work. So it became an integral tool for us to do our consulting properly and efficiently. Yep. And so there were lots of reasons that gas has, lots of the things that gas has in it is due to that consulting work and interacting with people. And then as a consultant, you go somewhere and do some work and then tell them what you did. You want them to keep doing it. But if they don't have the tools to keep doing it, then what's the fucking point, right? Yeah. So the early days of gas, that's sort of how it got out there, is we would do work for them. They'd see us using gas, go, oh, geez, that's cool. Can I do that? You're just, well, we'll do this, show you how to use it, and you can do it. Yep. And they'd buy it and do it like that. Mm-hmm. And, I had some geochem consultants at the time going, what the fuck are you doing? You're going to cut all of our throats, People can do it themselves. And I'd say, well, do you want to spend your life, you get jobs, you spend 3 weeks cleaning data up and 3 days looking at it and have to charge them a month's worth of work. Well, that's not my modus operandi, right? I'd rather not spend that 3 weeks doing that sort of shit stuff. So I said, no, I want people having tools to make that process incredibly efficient and get to a point where they actually come and ask you something interesting. Yeah, that's so then your consulting becomes interesting. And to go back to the hypothesis testing, you have people looking at their data properly and they come back, and then you start thinking about what is the physics and chemistry going on in this area that's creating that pattern that you can see in gas, and how can I link that back to an all-forming process or a dispersion process, the actual science of geoscience, right? Yeah. Rather than sitting and doing search, replace, people copying columns around and having the wrong labels on the top of columns, unit conversion errors, you just name it, right? And so to this day in gas, one of the most popular features is the data doctor.
Yeah, that's fine.
Which is a result of probably 150 man years of dealing with shit data and trying to automate fixing it when you just hit a button, right? I actually have the gas devs actually, oops, sorry, should I say this? Actually built me a special version of gas. And I used to forget, because they knew which license was mine and things would happen in the software. And I would forget, right? And so my version of the data doctor, the icon, was a bit like a Benny Hill nurse. Right? And I used to forget. Because this all time, I was just forget. And I'd be in a client's office showing them the data doctor and pressing this button, and they'd be looking at it and go, Dave, what's that icon?
It's 2.0.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's in beta. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's right. Don't worry about that.
And that ends part 1 of our interview with Dave. Next episode is part 2 of our interview. Join us then. This episode of Exploration Radio was brought to you by Ahmad Salim and Steve Beresford, produced by Sean Jeffrey, edited by Humayun Mir, and recorded live in Perth in August 2021. If you like what you've heard, we would love it if you reviewed us wherever you get your podcasts from. It helps us a lot. Exploration Radio is also supported by the Society of Economic Geologists, 121 Group, and The Assay. Until next time, let's keep exploring.